Welcome to episode 132 of 10-Minute Record Reviews. This time we're going to talk about Sonny Rollins' 1956 album on Prestige, Tenor Madness. And this is the 1984 Original Jazz Classics reissue, which is in mono and just sounds magnificent. So this is Sonny Rollins in his early prime with that rich, innovative tone on tenor, and he's on his way here in this record to basically being the unquestioned master of the tenor sax for a very narrow window, at least until Coltrane gets himself sorted out. Sonny Rollins was born in New York City in 1930. He grew up on 137th Street between Lenox and 7th Avenue. From the beginning, Rollins was influenced by Harlem's rich musical culture, both growing up on 137th Street, but then later on when his family moved to Sugar Hill. That move took them into a new neighborhood full of established musicians. These included Sonny's early idol Coleman Hawkins, and it was because of Hawkins' example that Rollins eventually decides to move to tenor, but it also included some younger players, Kenny Drew, Art Taylor, and Jackie McLean. Amazingly enough, and this kind of gives you a sense of the ferment in Harlem at the time, these were all school friends of Sonny Rollins, and together they would form pickup bands. They would also go and sneak into clubs and try to hear people like Charlie Parker, Lester Young, Ben Webster, and so on. New York City at the time was desegregating its schools, and Rollins and a number of his friends were bused to a school in an Italian neighborhood. That, of course, like a lot of desegregation efforts in the 1940s, was kind of a tense affair. And there were a few incidents, and it only settled down after no less than Frank Sinatra and Nat King Cole both attended the school and basically told the kids to keep a lid on it. But the move to that school, Benjamin Franklin High School, was significant for Rollins in another way because he met Lowell Lewis. Lewis was a trumpeter and was a high school bandmate of Rollins, but he was also jamming with Thelonious Monk at the time. Rollins and Lewis and other local musicians ended up going down to Monk's house regularly and jamming. This wasn't totally happenstance because Lewis was convinced that Rollins was a much better tenor player than the person who was regularly playing with Monk. Monk agreed, and so Rollins is now jamming consistently with this most famous of jazz pianists, and in the process he's learning some really complex music. This is his great apprenticeship. After he leaves school, the end of the 40s and the beginning of the 50s, Rollins is going through an intensely creative period, but it's a bit of a troubled period too, because he, like so many other jazz musicians, saxophonists and other players alike, who idolized Charlie Parker, saw somehow a link between Parker's heroin use and his creativity. And so, just like Chet Baker, just like John Coltrane, Sonny Rollins also became addicted to heroin, and the story of his next few years is of bursts of creativity and real problems associated to his drug use. He's dropping in regularly at the 845 Club in the Bronx, which was a place where a lot of the jazz players would come and have a Sunday jam, and it's here that he's first heard by Miles Davis. Miles hears Sonny play, he's very impressed, and he invites him to come play with his band. And this is an association which continues on and off through Sonny's various tribulations through much of the early 1950s. And it's a great combination too, because Miles' increasingly laid back, more minimalist style on trumpet contrasts really well with Rollins' much more aggressive, forthright sound on tenor, and it's a formula which Miles would go to subsequently after Rollins goes off on his own, and it characterizes, of course, Miles' relationship with Coltrane on record as well. Rollins is progressing enormously month by month in the early 1950s, but unfortunately he's also not really free of his demons. He's in jail for most of 1950 after being done for armed robbery. He comes out of jail in late 1950. Miles is still a fan, and he does some recordings with Miles in early 51. He does enough in these sessions to impress Bob Weinstock, who's a producer at Prestige, and Weinstock offers him a contract to record as a leader. He goes back into jail in 1952 for a parole violation, again related to his drug habit. He comes back out and he does some recording not only with Davis but also with Charlie Parker, and there's a famous interaction at one point in the studio between Parker and Rollins. Bird knew about Rollins' drug habit, and so he comes to him during a break at the session and says, "Look, are you high, are you clean?" And Rollins says, No, I'm clean," but he was high at the time. He gets ratted out by somebody else at the session, and Parker goes back to him and says, "Look, you could be a great player, but you got to clean up." While that might have been influential in the longer run, he didn't clean up right away, but he continues to record. In 1954, he records with the Modern Jazz Quartet, he records with Monk, and he also does a famous session with Miles Davis. This is a recording date in June 1954, which was initially released as Miles Davis with Sonny Rollins on a 10-inch disc, but eventually compiled into Miles' more famous release from 1957, Bag's Groove, which is basically a compilation. On that 10-inch release, 3 of the 4 recordings were actually Rollins' compositions, some of which he'd actually written in jail: Olio, Aragon, and Doxy. And here you see the other side of Davis, not so much the trumpet player as the star maker, and from that point on, Rollins could pretty much push open any door in the jazz world. He does 2 more albums as a leader, Sonny Rollins Quintet and Sonny Rollins, and then finally in 1955, he cleans up. He goes to Chicago, He ends up taking most of 1955 off, and during this period he actually turns down an offer from Miles to come and join his newly formed quintet, which he declines because he feels he still has to get his head together. Rollins eventually moves back to New York in November 1955, and he ends up getting work with Clifford Brown and Max Roach and their quintet, an amazing group which sadly is short-lived, of course, because of Clifford Brown's untimely death in a car accident. He stays for a while after Brown's death, but basically at this point his trajectory is to become a leader. He's now clean, and in 1956 and 1957 he releases no fewer than 6 albums under his own name as a leader. These are all with prestige, and they include Work Time, Moving Out, +4, this one, Tenor Madness, Saxophone Colossus, his other true masterpiece from this period, and Tour de Force. So this album is the 4th in that remarkable string of records, and it's kind of interesting because it pairs Rollins with Miles's quintet at the time, minus of course Miles, and nobody really knows whose idea that was, but it really works. The personnel include Rollins, of course, on tenor sax, Red Garland on piano, Paul Chambers on bass, Philly Joe Jones on drums, and in the title track, of course, Coltrane also playing tenor. It's a fascinating album historically, not only because of the pairing of what are probably the 2 greatest ever jazz tenor sax players, but also because at this stage, Coltrane, who would ultimately become really the true giant of the instrument, is very much the junior partner. Rollins is the established player. He's played with Miles. He has a contract as a leader. He's putting out a string of albums under his own name. Coltrane has yet to record as a leader, still struggling with his demons. Rollins is clean, Coltrane is not. And Coltrane is thus very much the junior partner here, the visitor on the established stars record. Side 1 starts with the title track, which of course is the only historical pairing of Rollins and Coltrane. And the contrast between Coltrane's intensity and Rollins' whimsy is very stark. I think it's excessive to call it a duel, but there's a lot of interplay between the 2 players. Coltrane is really quite identifiable. He's got a much brighter tone. Rollins here has a much, I find it almost like a thicker, wetter kind of a tone. There's a tremendous piece of interplay towards the end. Coltrane is doing a very Coltrane thing, which is taking a particular riff. You can imagine John Coltrane being a high jumper and just sort of running again and again and again until he jumped over that fence and then wanted to jump over it the right way. He does the same thing with particular riffs or particular licks in the saxophone. Anyway, he's doing that. Whether out of poking fun or fatigue or something like that, Rollins ends up basically playing the lick backwards. And Coltrane knew he had done this, and they were good friends, and he took it in the spirit in which it was intended. But basically, here's a guy who's confident enough in his own art, he's basically taking the piss out of John Coltrane. The only other track on side 1 is When Your Lover Is Gone, which is a cover of a song by Einar Swan. Rollins' playing is great, but really this is a track which gives Philly Joe Jones a real chance to shine. Side 2 starts with Paul's Pal, which is a Rollins composition. It's quite a light-hearted piece, and it was written by Rollins for Paul Chambers, the bassist on the gig. As you might expect from the title and the origin of the song, there's a fair amount of space here for Chambers to stretch out on bass. Rollins himself doesn't really solo as much on this track as he does offer a whole bunch of fills, and interestingly his tone is much different than it was in the title track. It's much spikier, I think. The next song is My Reverie, which is an adaptation of a piece called Reverie by Debussy. This is a ballad, it's a beautiful ballad, and Rollins has this very breathy tone, plays an extended solo, and that's followed by Garland, who gives us this really languid piece of playing. This is a really lovely, lovely track. The final track in the album is The Most Beautiful Girl in the World, which is an old Rodgers and Hart musical number, which is reproduced as a sprightly piece of hard bop. I think you can see this album and the string of albums which occur in a flurry around this time, 1956, 1957, as Rollins' first serious statement of himself as a musician. He's cleaned up, he knows what he wants to say, and he's in a hurry to say it. But that said, given the personal motivation behind the album, this is not a selfish record. It's not a self-centered record. What strikes me about this album is the generosity of Rollins as a leader, not only giving space to other folks like Coltrane, who in his case was in a more difficult spot than Rollins was at the time, but also his other bandmates. And there are lots of places where Rollins steps back, doesn't necessarily occupy the space that he might have done as a leader, as at least one track where he doesn't really solo at all. And so there was a real kind of collaborativeness and a generosity of spirit that I kind of hear on multiple listings to this album. This is a classic of the hard bop era. It's an incredible lineup. It's one of the great jazz albums of the 1950s, and it's 5 out of 5 for me.